Time for you to rethink.
You know the word annihilate? It means reduce to nothing.
Perished means killed.
We know what perished means.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Rethinking Hell Live, where evangelical Christians discuss what the Bible says about hell and put conventional and controversial views to the test. Join the discussion in YouTube's live chat, or email your feedback, questions, and episode suggestions to live@rethinkinghell.com. Rethinking Hell is on Facebook as well, and be sure to check us out on Patreon if you'd like to become a supporter of the show. See the description below for all links and details, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for future updates.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Rethinking Hell Live. For those of you who may not be very familiar with me and with the ministry here at Rethinking Hell, perhaps you're here to watch my interview with my guest today, which I'll talk about in a moment. For those of you not familiar with us, we are conservative evangelicals who believe in the authority, the reliability, and the inspiration, the infallibility, in my case, even the inerrancy of the Word of God, the Bible, Scripture. But we have become convinced that the Bible does not teach the traditional view of hell as eternal conscious torment, but rather that it teaches almost as clearly as it does anything else that the finally impenitent, the finally lost, the unsaved will be destroyed in hell, never to live again, rather than be made immortal and live forever in torment as the traditional view teaches. So that's kind of what we're about here at Rethinking Hell. Coming in close second to promoting and defending this view is our desire to model and encourage charitable dialogue between people who hold to the three different views of hell. And so that's not what we're going to be doing today, but there are past episodes of the show where you can see me discussing or critiquing traditionalists, believers in eternal torment. And I hope that that you do think that I've modeled good, charitable, friendly, respectful dialogue in those. A couple of introductory things I do every episode. First of all, please do, when the video is over, if you'd like to wait and see if you enjoy what you see here, please do, at that point, click the like button and the subscribe button. Those activities will help our YouTube videos and our channel to be more widely exposed, to reach more YouTube viewers. So please do that. Also, as I've been saying every week, even though I don't like doing so, we do need your continued financial support. We are entirely donation funded. We don't have advertising. We don't have any sort of income. It's all donations, and it's what enables us to do everything that we do. A number of us are doing this ministry work in our spare time, and that's fine. We don't need to receive any payment for that. But doing things like this YouTube live stream and buying the equipment necessary to stream it, our conferences, publications, and a host of other things do cost sometimes a great deal of money. So if you feel convicted to make a charitable donation, either a one-time or a recurring donation, please do go to rethinkinghell.com and click on the PayPal button at the top of the website, or go to patreon.com/rethinkinghell if you enjoy using the Patreon donations platform. As I've been saying for the past few weeks, we don't yet have any content available to patrons, but that is something that we hope to remedy in the not-too-distant future. So, again, if you feel led to, please do help us to continue to do what we do and to accomplish things that we, at this point, are hoping that we'll be able to accomplish, but will only be possible with your continued support. Speaking of things that your donations help to fund, our annual conference, our seventh annual conference, is going to be coming up next year in November of 2020. We are finalizing the details and working on getting the conference website up, which will include links for registration, call for papers if you want to propose a paper presentation that you'd present in a breakout or plenary session. All of those details will be put up on a conference website soon, but just to give you a little bit of a heads up in case you want to start marking your calendars and making plans, November 6th and 7th, that's Friday and Saturday, November 6th and 7th, 2020, will be our 7th annual Rethinking Hell conference. It's going to be in the greater Seattle area. We have a venue picked out and just about secured. It's actually in a suburb, I suppose, of Seattle called Federal Way. But you would fly into SeaTac Airport to get there. And the theme of the conference is going to be apologetics and the problem of hell. So the conference won't be so much a debate between the different views of hell as much as it will be us as Christians who do hold different views of hell, nevertheless working together to discuss how it is as Christians we might better deal with, address the apologetic problem of hell when we are witnessing to or being challenged by skeptics and atheists and other unbelievers who, for one reason or to one extent or another, object to Christianity because they think that it teaches the doctrine of eternal torment. So it should be really, really interesting. And because our theme is going to be on apologetics, all of our plenary speakers, except for me, although arguably to a certain extent this is true of me as well, are apologists, and they have some specialty in the exercise, the study and the practice of Christian apologetics, that is the defense of the Christian faith. So, for example, Braxton Hunter of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, he's the president of that seminary. He's also the main host of Trinity Radio, co-hosting it with Jonathan Pritchett, which is a YouTube channel, Trinity Radio. I would encourage you to check it out. He'll be one of the plenary speakers. Clay Jones of Biola University, and I think it's the Talbot Seminary there at Biola University. He will also be a plenary speaker, and he's done a bunch of work in the area of apologetics. In fact, I think he's the director, or he's on the board, or he's the president or something of Ratio Christi, and he's also a professor of apologetics at Biola. So his presence at the conference should be really interesting. Tim Barnett, who is one of the main speakers with the ministry Stand to Reason, which is sort of spearheaded by Greg Kokel. Tim will also be a plenary speaker, and he speaks on a wide variety of apologetics topics in the various conferences that he goes to. All three of them, and yours truly, that is me, will be speaking at the conference as plenary speakers. And what's interesting, I think, is that all three of those names are, to one degree or another, convinced of the traditional view of hell as eternal torment. I will be the only plenary speaker who represents an alternative, and we could talk about why, if you'd like at some time, why it is we don't have more equal representation, 2 and 2, or 1 and 1 if you count universalists. But we'll have the discussion another time. We felt that this was a really important time for Christians of the majority view, and for conditionalists and any universalists who'd like to attend as well, to get together representing a good cross-section or sample of the church and where it stands on the topic of hell. And that's why we didn't try to make it more even, because the reality is the majority of Christians are believers in eternal torment. So anyway, a lot of really good speakers, and of course we'll also have breakout speakers, some of whom may be more noteworthy than others, more famous than others, in case you want to see other prominent speakers besides the ones that I've just mentioned. So be on the lookout for the conference website. We've historically put the website up at rethinkinghellconference.com. That website probably still shows the details from this year's conference, 2019, but very soon it will be updated with the information for the 2020 conference. So if you want to be on the alert, if you want to be notified when or stay up to date with details as they are released, keep your eye on that website, or just check out the Rethinking Hell Facebook page, or the Rethinking Hell Facebook discussion group, or just rethinkinghell.com. Lots of places that you can go periodically to check in and see the details as they're made available. Caleb, thank you for wishing me Merry Christmas, and thank you, Ben, for saying hi, and Matt, thank you for your affirmation that I do model charitable dialogue. I do try to interact with the YouTube live chat, those of you who I haven't just named, and so if you have questions or comments, I'll try to field them as the show progresses. One last thing I want to say before I dive into my interview with my guest today. Actually, I have something even before that I want to cover. But on a personal note, I just wanted to say I'm really excited to announce that I've been accepted a proposal that I submitted to Fuller Theological Seminary, which is the school I'm going to right now for my Master of Arts in Theology, a proposal that I submitted to do a one-on-one directed study with an Old Testament professor there named Elizabeth Hayes has been accepted. We will begin a 10-week directed study in early January, and what I will be doing is researching Isaiah 25 and 26 and 65 and 66 and what those passages have to say, if anything, about eschatological life, death, and resurrection. So this will be an opportunity for me to focus entirely on a topic I'm interested in, and also one that it'll allow me to produce the academic writing sample that I will include in my PhD applications. As I mentioned in a previous episode of the show, my dream is to go on to do a PhD in Old Testament on Old Testament views of life, death, and afterlife. And so I think this will be a really good directed study to pave the way for that, to prepare my academic writing sample, and a lot of other stuff like that. So I will keep you up to date on this show and on my own personal Facebook page as those details unfold and as my research unfolds, and if indeed I get accepted into a PhD program. So with all of that intro out of the way, I do want to, before I dive into the interview today, follow up on something I said I would follow up on last episode. Last episode, I covered the question, what does the Bible say about unquenchable fire? And we looked at a number of different passages, Matthew 3:12, for example, Mark 9:48, and others. And what we saw was that, generally speaking, in Scripture, to quench means to put out, not to go out. It's a transitive thing. The subject puts out the fire rather than an intransitive action, which would be a fire going out. All right, that was what we generally saw, and indeed, major translations render Mark 9:48 and Isaiah 66:24 and other relevant passages as passives of that transitive use. Be put out. The fire will not be put out, or the fire will not be quenched, or is not quenched. That kind of thing. But one of the live viewers that's in the chat right now, Ben Davidson, he raised a really good question during the show. He apologized for derailing it, but he didn't need to. It was a great question, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have followed up on this, because what he asked, and here I'm going to switch to my Logos Bible software so you can see what's going on here, and I'm going to move a window here just so I don't lose it. So what Ben pointed out was that in Matthew 25:8, the foolish virgins say to the wise virgins, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." And you can see here that the idea, this is definitely that intransitive meaning of go out rather than to be put out or to put out, which is the transitive meaning. And so the question became, does that challenge the notion that to quench in the biblical language generally carries the transitive meaning of put out rather than the intransitive meaning of go out? Because if it's the intransitive meaning, well, then unquenchable fire could very well be fire which will not go out, right? But if it's the transitive meaning, put out, then unquenchable fire would be a fire that you can't put out, and because you can't put it out, it completely destroys. Whatever happens after the fire has reduced its fuel down to remains is not anything that the text is trying to communicate. It's simply trying to communicate that the fire won't be put out before it does its job. It won't be put out at all. It may burn out after it does its job, but it won't be put out. So what I want to do for a few minutes here before I dive into my interview today with my special guest is explain why I think that Matthew 25:8 doesn't in fact challenge our conclusions that we came to last episode. And I want to begin by saying a word or two about the voices, grammatically speaking, of English and Greek. What I'm talking about are the active and passive voices in English and in Greek. In English, an active voice is something like, I hit the ball. I'm the one doing the hitting, acting upon something else, and so it's active. But if I said, I was hit by the ball, well, now I was hit is a passive voice statement. It's saying, I'm the subject, but I'm not doing the acting, I'm being acted upon. All right. So this is the difference in English between an active and a passive voice. Well, as it turns out, Greek has a third voice that we don't really have in English, except for maybe in one or two words. I'm not entirely sure about that. But it's what's called the middle voice. And this is David Black's New Testament Greek grammar, in case you want to look this up for yourself. But notice what David Black says about the present, middle, and passive indicative. All right. Don't worry about what indicative means. If you're not interested in Greek, you don't really need to know. The point is, here he's dealing with the present tense of middle and passive voice verbs in New Testament Greek. Notice what he says. The significance of the passive voice is the same as in Greek as it is in English. The subject is receiving the action of the verb. The middle voice, on the other hand, represents the subject as acting in its own interest or in such a way as to participate in the results of the action of the verb. Sometimes the distinction between the middle and passive is not altogether clear, and a lot of times the middle form is indeed just the passive voice, just because of the way the word has come to be used. But the point here is that in Greek we have not only active and passive, but also middle voices. And the other thing that's really important is that in this present tense that we're looking at here, the forms of the middle and passive voices are identical. The only thing that you can look at to tell the difference between the middle and the passive voice, assuming the word supports multiple different voices, is the context. As David Black here says, the context alone will indicate whether the construction is middle or passive in function. All right. So what does this mean? It means that when we look at Matthew 25:8, I've pulled this up now with the interlinear Greek along with the parsing, that is the tense, voice, mood, all the various things that elements of the verbs and nouns and adjectives and things like that. And you can see here that going out is sbenuntai, which is V means verb, and then this second P, either the second P or the third P, or sorry, the first P or the second P, the second letter or the third letter here in the parsing listed under sbenuntai, that P means passive, but it's really middle passive. You can't tell, because again, the passive and the middle forms. Oh, I remember what I wanted to say. One of these P's is present tense. That's what the point that I wanted to make. All right. So sbenuntai in Matthew 25:8 is present tense. What that means, and it's middle passive, meaning you can't tell the difference just by the form between a middle voice, a middle meaning, or a passive one. All right. So then the next question becomes, well, okay, notice this is something that I brought up last week when I was looking at this initially. When you right-click on this in Logos Bible software and you say, I want to look up what this word means in Lunita, the lexicon I prefer, it takes you not to spenumi, which is the word in the active voice, but to spenumai, which is the middle voice meaning of that same verb. And notice how it defines it: to cease burning, possibly because of lack of material to be burned. That's the lamps going out. So it looks like what the lexicon here is doing is saying that it has a middle meaning rather than a passive one, because a passive meaning would be a passive of this verb spenumi, which means to cause a fire to be extinguished. So to be extinguished would be the passive voice. But here's what's really helpful for this word study that we're doing now. In the future tense, the middle and the passive are different. Notice what he says here. The future passive indicative is formed on another stem and will be learned in a later lesson, because right here he's dealing with the future, with the middle stem. So in the present tense, the middle and passive are indistinguishable from one another, but in the future tense, you can tell the difference. So now let's go to Mark 9:48. The fire is not quenched. And unfortunately, this still doesn't help us, because we're still dealing, as both of these P's indicate under spenuntai, we're still dealing in the present tense, the way that Jesus quotes Isaiah 66:24 here. But look at the Septuagint, the LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament completed in the couple of centuries leading up to Christ. Notice how it renders the original Hebrew. The fire And then here, notice that what we were looking at before was VPP, that's verb present passive. Well, now it's VFP, verb future passive. You see, it's not middle here. We'd know it because since it's in the future tense, you can tell the difference between the passive and the middle. But this isn't middle, it's passive. So this carries that meaning of be quenched rather than go out. Be extinguished, be put out, rather than go out, die out, burn out, however you might want to think of it. So so if you put all these pieces together, what we have is that, number one, the Septuagint translation of the original Hebrew translates quenched as a future passive, not as a middle, which could carry this meaning of go out, die out, burn out, whatever. It's a passive. So the idea here is that the fire cannot be put out or extinguished. Ben says, so it says that it's VPP, but it's really VMP. Yeah, that's right. Although, again, you can't tell the difference between the M and the P, the middle and the passive. So ultimately, it's going to be a judgment call that the person who tags the verbs has to make. But the best way to put it would be VPM/P, verb present middle / passive. But here in the Septuagint, it's future passive. And as we saw last week, in all these other places in the Hebrew Old Testament where God's fiery wrath is said to be not quenched, it has to do with this this transitive meaning of the fire can't be put out or extinguished. God's wrath won't be stopped from doing what it's supposed to do. All right, and that's why the Septuagint translators here translated it as a passive, not quenched. So that's one reason for understanding Mark 9:48 in this passive sense rather than in the middle intransitive go out, die out, burn out sense. And the other reason is simply because the majority of translators have recognized it as such. The majority of the translations will render Mark 9:48, Isaiah 66:24, and similar verses with the passive quenched rather than go out, die out, burn out, or whatever. And so when you put all this data together, what we see is that we have every reason for thinking that Mark 9:48 is using this language of fire not quenched in the same way that it's used throughout the Old Testament. It's God's fiery wrath won't be stopped, won't be put out, his fire won't be extinguished, and because of that, it will do its job of burning up, reducing to ashes that which his fire sets out to burn out. Ben asks, so you're saying that in the present passive it's ambiguous, but not so in the future? That's exactly right. In the present tense, you can't distinguish between the passive and the middle, except by context. But in the future, you actually have a different form of the actual word. So hopefully this helps. Ben, you in particular, since you brought up this excellent question, I hope this helps you out. But we have every reason, like I'm saying, for continuing to think that Mark 9:48 is about a fire that won't be put out. It's not about a fire that won't die out, won't go out, won't stop burning on its own, that kind of thing. That's just not what it means. So, Ben, excellent question. And those of you who are in the live chat or watching this after the fact, please do join us for another episode and join live if you want to ask questions. These are excellent things. They help us at Rethinking Hell to do continued research where perhaps no research has been done before. I can't think of anyone who's done the analysis on the future and present passive and middles of quench the way that I had the opportunity to do here, simply because a live viewer asked about it. One other live viewer, by the way, asks, Jesus equals 888, oxygen, sin equals 666, carbon. Anyone heard this before? No. Yeah, I don't have any idea what you're saying there. I'm sorry, TP. But do email me at live@rethinkinghell.com if you'd like me to dig into something, and perhaps we can discuss it in a future episode. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to switch now to my interview with my special guest, but I just want to point out, my guest's schedule couldn't accommodate the live stream, so he and I recorded our interview earlier, and I'm about to play it, and then I'll come back afterwards to say a word or two more, so be sticking around. But without further ado, I'll just say who it is that I've been teasing would be on the show here. It's my friend and friend of the ministry, Preston Sprinkle. Preston Sprinkle was a professor at Eternity Bible College, which was founded by by Francis Chan, with whom Preston co-authored the book Erasing Hell, which at the time it was published, well, I mean, even still to this day, concludes that the traditional view of hell as eternal torment is what the Bible teaches. That's what they concluded at the time, but for reasons that we will talk about in the interview here in a moment, Preston's mind eventually was changed, and he is now pretty firmly convinced of conditional immortality and annihilation. So without further ado, I'll just switch over and start playing that interview. I'll still be in the live chat, and so maybe I'll be able to interact a little bit better since I won't have to actually be doing the live stuff. I've already recorded this. It lasts about 50 minutes, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. And then after the interview is over, again, I'll come back in and say another word or two about one particular piece of intertestamental literature that comes up very briefly in this conversation. So here we go. Preston Sprinkle, my friend for several years now and friend of the ministry here at Rethinking Hell, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on again.
Viewers of Rethinking Hell Live, some of them won't be familiar with your story as it pertains to this topic and your relationship with Rethinking Hell over the years. And so I want to jump into that. But right now, your work really doesn't have a whole lot to do, I think, with hell mostly. So could you say a word or two for listeners that might have heard your name and don't really know, where your heart is and where your passions are and what you're up to these days? Can you say a word or two about what you're doing in terms of ministry and stuff like that nowadays?
Yeah, so been a professor and a writer for over a decade now, and my current research and ministry interest, or at least focus, would be on sexuality and gender. Been camping out there since about 2013. Wrote a book that came out in 2015 on sexuality, and that continues to be my full-time work is in sexuality and gender, but both on an academic level and also on a ministry level as well. But prior to that, I spent a few years focusing on hell, which brings us to this conversation.
Sure. You said that you've been a professor for many years. That was at Eternity Bible College. Are you still affiliated with them, or have you guys parted ways? I can't remember.
So we parted ways in 2016. Nothing negative. It was just I was planting an extension campus up here in Boise, and it didn't work. So I kind of moved on to doing what I do now full time with sexuality and gender. Yeah. So I was with them from 2009 to 2014. Before that, I was at Cedarville University, and then taught for a little bit at Nottingham University in the UK.
Okay. And just so that listeners who aren't already familiar with you don't start freaking out, when you say that your work is on sexuality and gender, are you going around telling people that it's that homosexual behavior is okay and that it's, are you gay affirming, that kind of thing, or?
No. And as you know, Chris, the language is super tricky. So I am affirming of human beings, and I want the Creator's best for that human being. My message is high on love, high on truth, and I believe God's design for sexual expression is between one man and one woman in the context of a one flesh covenant that we now call marriage.
But would you say that one of the things that you're trying to change is perhaps the way the dialogue happens between Christians and the people that would call themselves gay affirming, in the way that we treat each other, in the way that we speak to and about people that struggle with same-sex attraction, that kind of thing? Is that where your heart is?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, tone, language, posture, it's I don't want to say it's everything, but it's almost everything in this conversation. Not just what we believe, but how we believe it. And as much as I'm very passionate about the so-called traditional view of sexuality and marriage, how we have gone about that has been just pretty terrible for the most part, and has caused way more problems than I think we need. I think the church needs to absolutely stick to the truth of Scripture, but also passionately love people who are falling short of that standard.
So if people want to pick up that book that you mentioned that you published in 2015 on this topic, what is the name of that, and how do you recommend people go ahead and get their hands on it?
People to be loved, why homosexuality is not just an issue. It's about 70% I would think, in-depth Bible study on relevant passages and themes on sexuality, on homosexuality in particular, then other ministry and relational questions. But it just has, if I can say so myself, a very different tone than maybe other books that have been written like that. It's on Amazon. I have a website, PrestonSprinkle.com, that has all my books, and also the ministry I run, Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. We have a website with loads of resources. Centerforfaith.com has books, articles, blogs, papers, resources, and so on.
Awesome. That was the last question I was going to ask you on that topic. So let's start then talking about hell. Those who have followed our ministry and yours for the past several years will know that at the 2018 Rethinking Hell conference in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you were gracious enough to be one of our plenary speakers and came out fairly strongly in support of conditional immortality and annihilationism, whereas that hasn't always been your leaning. So maybe we could start with leading up to the publication of the book that first introduced me to you, and I'll mention the name of that in a second, but I want to tell a little bit of a story. What was your what was your experience when it comes to the hell debate? Is it something that you had studied much? Did you have what you would now consider to have been an informed opinion, or was it just sort of something you imbibed from Christian culture and your church and stuff like that?
Chris, yeah, it was the latter for sure. I mean, my academic area of, well, my PhD is on early Judaism, the first century context of the New Testament. So I had a background in the kind of source material that's very important for this conversation, but I hadn't explored specifically biblical or New Testament questions related to hell. I very much was an absorbed perspective where, like most evangelical Christians, the word hell meant eternal conscious torment. To deny ECT meant to deny hell, meant to deny the Bible, meant to deny Jesus, and all these things are very much linked. And I can give you more background on just the kind of theological psychology of how we hold on to beliefs. That's incredibly important for this conversation. But so when I went into, Francis Chan and I, and we may talk about this later, decided to co-write a book together on hell, we both, to the best of our abilities, went in with a lot of honesty and I don't want to say a blank slate, but I mean with the admitted perspective that we haven't actually studied this, and let's just be open to what the Bible has to say about this. And so we did a bunch of research and wrote a book on what does the Bible say about hell. But the question we were asking wasn't annihilation versus ECT. It really was two questions. Number one, is there a place called hell that is a place of punishment in the afterlife? Not the kind of hell on earth, genocides and all these things are totally horrible, but is that what the New Testament means when it says hell? That's one question. The second question is, if people do go there, can they get out of there once they're there? So kind of universalism versus the traditional view, broadly speaking. Now, we did have all of 2.5 pages on the annihilation versus ECT question. And looking back, I kind of cringe on how we even handled that. But we kind of were, and on a personal level, off the record, live, and we were kind of like, wow, we did not realize how complicated that question is, ECT versus annihilation. Like, man, we need to look into this a little more. But we both were like, well, that's not really the purpose of this book, to talk about the specifics of hell. We just want to know, like, is there a hell? Is it irreversible? So we said, yeah, we think there is a hell. We think it's irreversible. In terms of it's almost like those 2.5 pages was like an extended footnote. Like, well, when it comes to annihilation versus ECT, we lean towards ECT based on these 3 passages, which, if anybody has been in this conversation, you probably know the 3 passages I'm talking about. The Matthew 25, 25:46, Revelation 14, 9-11, and Revelation 20, 10 to 15 or whatever.
Yeah.
And I would say, just to our defense, I guess, but because that wasn't the primary question, we didn't feel the need to spend loads of time and energy really landing on that. We're kind of like, it's complicated. we should look into this more in the future, but for the sake of this book, we're going to lean towards the traditional view.
Yeah, it wasn't set out. You guys didn't set out to write a book in defense of the doctrine of eternal torment, so it really didn't make sense to devote a significant portion of your book to that debate, and I totally get that. What year? So, of course, I don't know if you mentioned the title of the book, but we're talking about the book Erasing Hell, which was a really big hit, sold tons of copies. And what year are we talking here? I've forgotten. Is it 2011-ish or
2011? Yeah, we wrote it and published it within an 8-week span.
Oh wow, cool.
So yeah, for you writers out there, when the publisher says when you turn in the manuscript, it won't come out for another 12 to 18 months, that is traditionally how it happens. But just so everybody knows, it is physically possible for a publisher to turn around a book in 4 weeks if they're
motivated to, right? Yeah. And as you pointed out, you guys cited, if only, maybe a little hesitantly or tentatively, on the side of eternal torment. And I remember at the time, the ministry Rethinking Hell was just starting, or just started very shortly after that, and it was not much earlier than that I had become friends with somebody that's a friend of the ministry named Ronnie Demler. And it was actually Ronnie who, on his own blog at the time, published a blog article saying Erasing Hell is actually a pretty good book. And he was, of course, on our side of the debate, and is very often critiquing defenses of eternal torment because of how bad they are. And here he is saying, actually, this is a pretty decent book. And it was through Ronnie that I think you and I eventually connected. Can you speak a moment or two about how, after the publication of Erasing Hell, how it is that you continued to engage a topic and got connected with Ronnie and then ultimately me?
I don't know exactly where it came across. I know in the aftermath of the book, I was engaging in kind of a flurry of interviews and podcasts and blogs, and I had just started blogging at that point. Podcast wasn't even around. Well, I guess it was around. I wasn't doing it. So I was kind of getting introduced to the whole world of internet theological conversations. So it must have been in the wake of that Ronnie and I connected. But, the more, after the book was published, I kept kind of looking at the, let's just say, traditional view versus universalism, and every time I kind of reconsidered that, I was more convinced of the traditional view. I was less convinced of the universalistic view, even though, honestly, if I can be honest, that's where my heart, if you want to talk emotions, that's where my emotions would be, is the universal. To me, it's the only real solution to the problem of evil. Maybe, I don't know if you have a better, to me it's like that kind of does solve it. All the other responses come short.
Yeah, they leave something to be desired, maybe is what you're...
Yeah, and I'm fine. I'm totally fine with the mystery. I'm enough of a Calvinist to know that, there's a mystery. I'm God. God's God. I'm not, so I'm fine with that. But the emotionally universalism is very attractive to me. Exegetically, the more I looked at it, while I would admit there are isolated passages and certain arguments that I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. The weight just didn't seem to be there exegetically. But then when I did the same thing and kind of kept revisiting annihilation versus ECT, which wasn't, again, a main focus of our study, but the more I kept looking into that, every time I revisited that, I kept seeing more evidence for annihilation. And every time I revisited a question I had, or kind of like, well, yeah, but what about this? What about that? Those what-abouts went in the favor of annihilation every time I revisited it with an honest perspective. And for me, again, I think it is, and again, I think this is so significant, psychologically and even socially, I had the freedom to go where the text leads. So once you have that social, psychological freedom to truly go where the text leads, only then can you truly consider the exegetical weight for one side or the other. If you're in an institution where you would get fired, if you're in a ministry where you could no longer be in ministry, if your paycheck's connected to holding certain views, or if you're in a certain very tribalistic context where you would lose friends, family, relationships, opportunities, money, if you change your view, you're a fool to think that doesn't contribute to how you read the Bible. It's just does. Like, that's just basic psychology. I happen to be in a place where between ECT and Annihilation, I had that freedom, and so I was taking honest looks at the text, and I was just continually shocked at how much exegetical support there was for Annihilation. And in the midst of that, we had our first conversation, and I was still on the ECT side, not really passionately, but I was there.
I think here we're talking about
you were raising questions and pointing out things, and I'm like, man, this is just, if I'm honest and humble enough to admit that you're bringing up really good points, I'm like, yeah, there's some exegetical merit.
Yeah, if listeners or viewers want to check that out, I think we're talking about way back at the beginning of our podcast, episodes 5 and 6 of the Rethinking Hell podcast. And, you mentioned the big three a few minutes ago, and that was sort of the focus of that 2-hour-long conversation we had, is these big three. And like you said, Matthew 25, Revelation 14, Revelation 20. So I would encourage viewers to check that out. But anyway, so we did that, and then at some point, a couple of years after that, you had your blog on Patheos, and you ended up having, who is now our mutual friend, Jerry Shepard, an Old Testament professor at, I forget which school. Tell us what sort of prompted you to set up that blog debate between Jerry and me, and what sort of feedback did you get? Did you find that it was a fruitful conversation? Did anybody sort of begin to rethink things as a result of that, or...
I've never met Jerry in person. He's been on my blog quite a bit, and he seemed like a, staunch proponent of ECT, but seemed to have like really thought through it. Like, he's one of those guys that if he's going to say something and say it strongly, he's going to have loads of reasons to support it, and really really thoughtful guy. And I would think the same of you,
Thank
Chris.
You.
Very thoughtful, very exegetically thorough. Maybe that would be a good phrase. Very thorough. If they're going to say something publicly, they're going to have thought through the kind of counter thing. So I said, oh man, as I'm still working through this ECT versus Annihilation, and at that point I was definitely on the Annihilation side, but I'm like, yeah, this guy seems like he's really thoughtful, thorough, and it's almost like I'm trying to find a reason to stay with ECT, even though I wouldn't say stay, but I'm like, okay, this guy seems really thorough, thoughtful. Whenever he talks about any other topic, I'm like, man, he raised really good points. Really hard to counter-argue that. But then whenever I hear you talk, I'm like, yeah, that's strong too. So I'm like, let's just see him go head-to-head. And yeah, that was just one of many steps in my journey where I'm like, if I really look back and look at the strength of both sides, I'm like, I think the strength of your exegetical arguments and counter responses to his arguments were just far, far exegetically superior. So yeah.
And those blog articles, I'll make sure to include links for viewers, but there's a lot of interaction in the comments, not only with readers but also with me and Jerry as well, so that's something that viewers may want to check out as well. Now, I don't remember around what date that was, but by this time if this is correct, you've been increasingly leaning toward conditional immortality and annihilationism, although you hadn't yet been fully convinced. At some point, I was able to persuade you, and the ministry was able to cover the fee, the speaking fee and stuff, to have you come speak at the last year's conference, like I said earlier. Was preparing for that conference and the presentation that you gave, did that take you further along? If right in the middle is on the fence and you were leaning somewhat toward conditionalism and annihilationism, did preparing for that lead you even further?
Yes, yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, I would say I don't know how to measure this. I was probably 70 to 80% there already. Largely for two reasons, and it was I had already edited the 4 views on Hell book, even though it's really 3 views, but it's called 4 views. But and even through that editorial process, even through that editorial process, being able to read, significant contributions on all sides, so it drew me back into doing my own research, cross-checking as an editor, cross-checking their arguments, doing stuff. So that bumped me from about 55% to about 60, I would say 70, 80%. And then I kind of, let it sit for a little bit. And then when you invited me to the conference, I said, well, I'm pretty pretty much there. But I always want to be honest. So I want to be honest with where I'm at. But yes, I will put loads of time into research into this paper for my own sake and for the sake of the conference. And yeah, when I revisited the material yet again, it was both the arguments for ECT. This is really important in my personal journey. It was seeing how people were trying to argue for ECT that just looked very, I gotta be careful with that, just not only unconvincing, but almost I almost felt embarrassed for the person. Like, really brilliant people. And I really mean that from the bottom of my heart, brilliant people. When it came to arguing for ECT, just making arguments that I just felt like were so blatantly irresponsible and just seemed like they were trying their best to just find something to say about this view that just didn't seem persuasive at all. So it's both the arguments that I kept seeing over and over for ECT, also compared with the arguments for annihilation, that I'm like, both of these are convincing me for annihilation. And any kind of what about this, what about that, was pretty much satisfied. So that to this day, I mean, and I don't think this is an overstatement, this is an honest perspective of my heart, the annihilation view of hell, to my mind, this is just my anecdotal experience, to my mind, is one of the clearest things in Scripture that I've ever studied in terms of doctrine. I mean, even some orthodox things like the deity of Christ, humanity of Christ, the personalhood of the Holy Spirit, like even the humanity, deity of Christ, it's like we believe in both because it's such a complicated thing, you know. But I just even in that conference, as you know, I put up kind of a list of all the passages that I think would clearly side with annihilation versus the 3 on the ECT side. And even that 3 I think is generous, because I don't think anymore that Matthew 25 or Revelation 20 at least carries any weight at all. Revelation 14, maybe one line in that passage by itself, if I was on a desert island and that's all I had, okay, sure, I might believe in ECT, but there's so many other questions that surround that. But again, well, that's true with any doctrine. Yeah. There's always going to be a verse or two on the other side, but the weight of Scripture, convinces you otherwise. But it is really remarkable how few of those arguably challenging texts there are, right? I mean, compared to some of the other things we're talking about, take for example the personhood of the Holy Spirit. Arguably, there's a much smaller body of biblical evidence in support of it, and arguably some challenges to it, more challenges to it than those tiny handful of 3 texts that you mentioned, which really only boil down to one, Revelation 14. Yeah. Now, to be fair, viewers can watch your presentation. It's available on YouTube now. And to be fair, one of our fellow plenary speakers at that conference, Greg Allison, who did the historical presentation, I think that he asked you during Q&A, or he suggested that a lot of believers in eternal torment would have actually put several of the texts that you had on the annihilation side in the eternal torment side. So, you and I agree with the way that you stacked up those sets of texts, but in the interest of full disclosure, right, there are some who would say that isn't entirely accurate. But nevertheless, you did, having done this research, you came out pretty strongly in favor of conditionalism. Since then, or even somewhat before, have you experienced any sort of fallout, any sort of pushback or anything as a result of coming out pretty firmly in favor of this view, or has it been pretty, not a big deal? That's a good question. Not really. There was one church we were kind of exploring that had a clear ECT kind of statement, and they kind of knew my view, and we didn't really. It was a great church. I mean, it wasn't. I heard horror stories about church experiences where people go through this. So there's no, they had and they were really thoughtful about it too. Like they had thought through it, But yeah, I think my any kind of I wouldn't have any kind of future involvement with that church because of my view. I could kind of attend the services. But beyond that, I wouldn't be able to preach, lead a Bible study, do anything like that. Which part of me is kind of great. Like, I can come and like, there's no pressure on me to actually serve because of my view. Hey, I mean, I guess in a weird, ironic way, that could be refreshing. But, but again, I wouldn't even put that in the category of like any kind of hostile at all. Like, I would still be good friends with them. But yeah, and part of it is I don't Google my name, so I don't really know.
Yeah.
No, I really don't. I mean, I really take seriously that proverb that says, and he's addressing a king or whatever, but don't listen too closely to what people are saying about you. So there may be loads of missed opportunities I've had because of it that I'm not even aware of. But no, I haven't had any direct. And part of it's because I'm an independent. I run and the president of a nonprofit. I write my own doctrinal statement. I'm speaking on sexuality and gender, so I haven't experienced that, to my knowledge, being disinvited because they Googled around and saw that I'm a annihilationist. So I haven't personally faced any hostility, but I think I would if I was in a traditional kind of university context or a pastor.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate you sharing your story with us. I want to shift gears and spend just a few minutes connecting your PhD specialty with the topic of hell and talk about intertestamental Judaism, because you said that your PhD was related to the first century Jewish background to the New Testament, the stage, if you will, of in which the New Testament is set. And as you are probably familiar with, many defenders of the doctrine of eternal torment, which for viewers' sake is what you've been referring to when you've been using the acronym ECT, short for eternal conscious torment. But many defenders of that view will say that sort of the intertestamental Jewish view of hell was that of eternal torment, and that the New Testament doesn't challenge that view in any way or give us any reason to think that Jesus and his apostles didn't agree with this sort of monolithic intertestamental Jewish view of eternal torment and hell. So the first question I want to ask you is, based on your familiarity with the intertestamental literature, would you say that characterization is accurate? Would you say that, by and large, Jews between the Testaments did believe in eternal torment?
No, that is just factually wrong. If somebody says that the Jews between the Testaments believed in eternal conscious torment, that is just historically factually wrong. That's just an observation. That is just not true. So, as anybody who's dabbled in literature knows, that there is diversity within and let's just say the 80 or so Jewish texts written between 300 BC and, I don't know, let's push it up to 180 or something like that. There's loads of diversity on almost every single topic within theological Judaism. When it comes to eschatology, including the afterlife for the righteous and the wicked, there's loads of diversity. When it comes specifically to the eternal conscious torment view of hell, there are some texts that would seem to have that view. Almost all of them, to my knowledge, and for my viewers, please cross-check this. This is me. I think this is correct, but please verify this. They are a small minority of texts that would on face value seem to be ECT, and almost all of them, if not all of them, are kind of post 70 AD, late first century, early second century, which doesn't mean that's just still part of Judaism, but for the most part, when it comes to kind of pre-New Testament, like the stuff that is really forming the backdrop for the New Testament, pre-first century or even early first century, almost every Jewish expression on what's going to happen to the wicked would be more under the umbrella of an annihilation type of perspective, because that is the Old Testament view, and maybe we can get into that. But for early Jewish literature, like the first kind of, if you took intertestamental Judaism and took the kind of first half of that, they're going to be much closer to kind of more of an Old Testament perspective when it comes to eschatology. But let me stop there, because there's just
that's right.
But so to summarize, there's loads of diversity. if you added just the number, numerically there'd be more weight on the annihilation side. But certainly there are some texts that would suggest an eternal conscious torment. Those would be primarily later Jewish texts. If you want names, I mean, parts of 1 Enoch, 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch, and others, and these are all more later works.
Just out of curiosity, to what would you personally attribute the change from the first half of the intertestamental period to the second half, where you said that it went from being predominantly annihilation to having a greater diversity of voices in favor of eternal torment? Because, there are a few possible options, it seems to me. One could be Israel's increasing Hellenization, right? Mm-hmm. So that could be part of it. It could also be that, especially with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, it could have been that there was a lot of emotions involved and hostility toward Israel's surrounding neighbors, things like that. Do you have any thoughts on what might have caused that diversity to increase during that period of time?
That's great, Chris. And honestly, your two suggestions would be the two that popped into my mind before you even said them. Hellenization, more Neoplatonic thought that sort of became intertwined with some Hellenistic Jewish thinking, or even Palestinian Judaism wasn't completely immune to Hellenization either. What's that good book? Martin Hengel, the Judaism and Hellenism, I think, classic works talking about just the real complexity between raw Palestinian Judaism and Hellenistic Judaism. Like, those two categories are really blurred in the intertestamental period. I think some strands of Hellenistic Greek thinking would allow for immortality of the soul kind of thing. But also, I think the destruction of the temple in post-70 AD Jewish reflection on things like the afterlife, Jewish reflection took on a more kind of, no longer did they hope for kind of a this-worldly intervention of God, a more earthly, this-worldly redemption and punishment. Now the Jewish kind of thinking on God and retribution took more of an afterlife kind of perspective, so that it allowed for more exploration on kind of a more ethereal or heavenly or afterlife kind of perspective, rather than, the Old Testament view where God's going to intervene and, stomp out Babylon and Persia and reestablish the Davidic kingdom on earth. A very, and this is N.T. Wright and others, this is a very earthy, very this worldly kind of perspective on punishment, even in terms of retributive punishment or afterlife punishment. Isn't really afterlife, it's more this life, but after 70 AD, that hope kind of started to really be transferred to a more traditional afterlife perspective. So these are my thinking out loud thoughts, but I think there's some definite merit there. Yeah, it is an important question, because it is interesting that almost all of the real explicit, gruesome ECT kind of statements, even in Christianity, it's second century stuff. It's the Apocalypse of Peter. It's these kind of Gnostic, non-canonical Gospels. It's Jewish literature around that time. Third Enoch or second Enoch as well, and all the kind of real, almost Dante-ish ECT statements are second century, maybe late first century. So it is an interesting question. Why is that?
I wonder if what you were just describing might not have only affected their focus from being sort of this worldly to next worldly, but also prompted them to use much more language that is much more open to being misinterpreted by we moderns. Because like take for example, I want to share this screen with you here. This is from a Qumran scroll that you're somewhat familiar with, I'm sure, known as the Community Rule or Rule of the Community. And if I'm not mistaken, this being a part of the Qumran community, this would have been in a very eschatologically oriented community, right? Because the Essenes and the Qumran community were much more, separatists and much more about light versus darkness and, all this kind of thing. And what's interesting to me is when you read this, or when I read it anyway, there are parts of it that sound an awful lot like eternal torment to me. So, for example, May God hand you over to terror by the hand of all those carrying out acts of vengeance. May he bring upon you destruction, and we'll come back to that in a second. May he bring upon you destruction by the hand of all those who accomplish retributions. Accursed are you, sentenced to the gloom of everlasting fire. May he not be merciful. May he not forgive. On and on it goes. There's even, we've got this language of everlasting fire, and some other translations get even more gruesome than that. But what's interesting to me is one of the things in this scroll that leads me to believe that this is actually reflects a belief in annihilation is the Hebrew that underlies this word destruction, because from what I can tell, this Hebrew word kala, which is translated destruction there, in both halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, for viewers that don't speak lexicon acronyms, halot, both it and BDB, Brown Driver Briggs, both of them list as the definition for this word things like come to an end, vanish, fade, perish. There's even one of the definitions I saw in here in somewhere, and I can't find it at the moment, but I mentioned it in a previous episode of Rethinking Alive, is actually the gloss annihilation. So you've got apparently this Qumran scroll using incredibly vivid language that could easily be mistaken by the less than careful reader as affirming eternal torment, but a closer examination of the text reveals that it's actually affirming annihilation or destruction. So I guess what I'm wondering is, I sort of have a two-part question. The first part of it is, do you think it's possible that this shift in outlook from this worldly to next worldly not only affected not only caused some of them to be caused more of them to believe in eternal torment than maybe had previously been the case, but also do you think that it could have prompted them to use language that we're much more likely to misinterpret, and maybe it calls for a closer look than we might have otherwise thought? What do you think?
99% of them in Qumran are clearly in an annihilation perspective. And you can't just look at even individual passages and words in Qumran. You have to look at their whole eschatological framework. Like, they did have this worldly perspective. I mean, you have one document in Qumran where they were like, getting ready to fight the end time battle, and they have like marching orders on how to defeat the Romans, and you even have this from an archaeological perspective. And when the Romans did kind of finally wipe out the Qumranites, like, they had a very, very this worldly, non-ethereal view of the afterlife. And even there's debates about whether or what kind of even resurrection of the righteous they even envisioned. So their whole eschatological framework really was set up to support nothing but like an annihilation view. And there's just loads of passages, and I've got tons in front of me if you want me to read them, that clearly talk about an annihilation of the wicked. So this is 1QH. This is their 1QH is the Hadayot, the Psalms. Like, there's a whole body of like Psalm literature that they produce that's all poetic and very theological, very dead. A lot of judgment themes, and they love to sing about the judgment of God. And this is 1QH 14:29-30. It says, "The sword of the God will pounce in the era of judgment, and all the sons of his truth will awaken to destroy Lahatam, the sons of wickedness, and all the sons of guilt will no longer exist. Lo Yahayu." It's
the copula. Yeah, it's not B, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But this is one verse. Somebody says, "Oh, this is one verse." Well, there's just loads of this kind of stuff where it's not just isolated language of destruction, but the description surrounding that just reinforces this life will no longer exist in any sort of conscious way. Is gone, not alive anymore. So when we come to 1QS, the community rule, column 2, even there is, as you pointed out, there's a blend of very clear destruction language, which is universally used throughout the scrolls, of a clear annihilation, but also this kind of like, the statements that people latch onto for ECT. But you have to raise the question, like, it could be that, okay, to be fair, it could be that. That's an option. But what do you do with the destruction language that's right next to it? And could this ECT-ish language could it be just reinforcing the strength of the destruction? Is it actually, are they actually against their whole eschatological framework? Are they actually talking about some never-ending existence of the wicked person, which just they don't have a category for that kind of thing? So, which, we think ECT is the harsher thing. For them, like the complete Sodom and Gomorrah kind of annihilation to them was like that was the the death blow, the God really pouring out his wrath. Yeah. Because they didn't have a category for something like the immortality of the soul.
Right. Now, okay, so I wonder, do you think that might warrant a re-examination of some of those other books that maybe aren't part of the Qumran community that you mentioned earlier? Enoch, Ezra, Baruch, other things that have been alleged, even by some people on our side of the debate, to teach eternal torment. Do you think that perhaps what we're seeing, even here right before our very eyes, might be a reason might call for a closer examination of some of those books to see if perhaps there's language there affirming annihilation that has been overlooked because of all the other hyperbolic and extreme language? Or do you think that maybe it's a difference in community? You've got the Essenes community here, and then you've got over here perhaps Ezra and Enoch and stuff like that. What do you think?
That's a good question too. I do want to caution anybody who is on the annihilation side. We need to be careful not letting the interpretive snowball happen to where we're wanting to see something, we see something like, aha, got it, and then we're almost motivated to bend things in our direction. So we just need to be constantly self-aware of our own confirmation bias of interpreting things. So with that said, I do think when we're dealing with the massive diversity in Judaism, I mean, anybody who's done an advanced degree knows that we talk about early Judaisms, not Judaism. There's no Judaism. There's Judaisms, sects and trains of thought, and there's just so much diversity. So with that diversity, we have to kind of ask the question: where does the New Testament fit in the broad spectrum of the Judaisms? And then when we go to look for background or parallel literature, we're not just aimlessly grabbing on to random
anything Jewish, right?
Yeah. Exactly. We want to identify what are the kinds of Judaisms that really resonate with New Testament thought, that have the hope of a Davidic Messiah, that look for maybe in a messianic figure that was central to what they were. Because not every branch of Judaism was looking for the Messiah. People don't know that. I mean, the whole hope of a Davidic Messiah was one kind of Judaism. There's other types of Judaism that could care less about, a Davidic Messiah. You took First and Second Maccabees. They had the whole Maccabean Revolution, and they weren't Davidic, and yet they were kind of prototypes of the future Messiah. So I do want to narrow what is not just the Jewish literature that happens to have statements that correlate with the New Testament. What's the kinds of Judaisms that had a holistic way of thinking that resonated with New Testament thought? That would be the best background material. So when I looked at that question, there's two bodies of literature that I think are really helpful. In particular, the Psalms of Solomon, nothing to do with Solomon, is arguably the only piece of Jewish literature that we have that was written by a Pharisee. They say it comes from Pharisaical circles. Knowing that Paul was a Pharisee, Jesus, the reason why he the Pharisees rubbed him wrong, because he kind of was one. He was in that kind of, he wasn't an Essene, he wasn't he had some resonance there, but he definitely wasn't a Sadducee. Jesus and Paul, the whole New Testament is within the kind of wider world of Pharisaical Judaism. They were all hoping for a Davidic Messiah. Pharisaism believed in the resurrection of the dead. They had categories for the spiritual world. There are a lot of resonance there. So the Psalms of Solomon are a really important body of literature. There's 18 Psalms that have a lot of resonance with New Testament thought. And they talk a lot about the afterlife, the punishment of the wicked, the resurrection of the righteous. They have a lot of statements on this. Now, when we look at that, you have clear statements about the resurrection and eternal life of the righteous, and clear statements about the annihilation of the wicked. So it's also preserved in Greek. So you have apolumi, and you have like Greek words that are used in the New Testament, also used in what would now be the translation of the Psalms of Solomon. And so you have clear, and again, I'm not saying this in itself proves, but this is a better body of literature to look for background material. The other body of literature is what we're just talking about, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, as anybody who's dabbled in this knows, the Dead Sea Scrolls have remarkable parallels with loads of things that Paul talked about Jesus, like so many parallels that people, for a while when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered and interpreted, people were like, some people said, well, the whole New Testament is nothing but like a fabrication, like a copying the Dead Sea Scrolls, because there's so much.
Yeah.
There's even one scroll, I think it's at the end of the community roll, that talks about, when the Messiah comes, he will break bread with his 12, followers and drink wine, before he dies. And it's like, what, did the New Testament just copy this? And I don't think so, but there's so much remarkable resonance. So when I said, and I'm just going to say it, people can, see if I'm right, but there's just overwhelming evidence that the Qumran community were believing in annihilation. And they talked about it a lot. They love to talk about the judgment of the wicked, and the language they use is so parallel with the New Testament. So all that to say, when we get to like some of these other books, where we might find ECT statements, I'm not saying they're not relevant. I'm just saying we have to ask a broader question. Do they come from a kind of Judaism that does, on a theological and thoughtful level, do they overlap with New Testament thinking? And some of them do. For Ezra, which has some ECT statements, everybody knows that book has major parallels with the book of Revelation.
And Enoch is quoted in books like Jude, right?
Yeah. I think some Enochic literature. Enoch is a compilation of 5 different books.
First Enoch. I should.
Yeah, well, even First Enoch is just 5 books that go into one. Enoch spans about 200 years, so it's a composite work.
I see.
But yeah, the apocalyptic sections in Enoch, we have to really, at the very least, dig into. Don't just quote the text, which is what I did in Rethinking Hell, I confess. I kind of grabbed on the statements. But I think we really need to pay attention to the specific body of literature we're looking at. So for Ezra, it really parallels Revelation. And they both have similar kind of ECT-like statements, but then we have to ask a bigger question about apocalyptic literature and what's going on there. Yeah. Romans parallels the wisdom of Solomon in many ways. Wisdom of Solomon has clear destruction of the wicked, annihilation, while endorsing resurrection of the righteous. That's another thing. Does the body of literature, does it have a clear perspective on the resurrection of the righteous? Because that piece in the framework needs to be there, because that's obviously everywhere in the New Testament.
Right.
So what's interesting is when a Jewish book has clear statements about the resurrection of the righteous, but an annihilation of the wicked, where it's not like a one-to-one, like if they affirm eternal life for the righteous, therefore it would be eternal life for the wicked. That's just, we see a lot of statements in Judaism where it's yes for the righteous, but no eternality for the wicked.
Yeah. Very good. I don't want to take up much more of your time. I'll just ask you one last question, and this just occurred to me. But, I've been reached out to at least a couple of times by young conditionalists who are interested in, they're working on filling out their PhD applications and stuff, and they're thinking, what can I do as a budding scholar to contribute in a scholarly way to this ongoing debate, to this ongoing topic? Are there any specific areas of research that you think are really ripe for the harvest, as it were? For new scholars that want to cover ground that may not have already been covered.
That's good. The one in particular that I'm really interested in is a real thorough, and maybe if it's been done, correct me, Chris, you would know, but I think looking at the Septuagint use of apolumi, apolumi for sure, but like the Greek words that are often translated destruction.
Olathros. Yeah.
What's that?
Olathros, right? That's
apolumi, apolune, the verb, olathros. There's a couple others I have written in there somewhere. Thanatos, well, just death. Thora, disintegration, corruption in Galatians 6:8, 2 Peter 1:4. So I think, but primarily I would say apolumi alone. That alone would be massive. But look at a Septuagint, do a word search in the Septuagint, which I did, but there's loads of hits.
Yeah, right.
And really come up with like, how is this word used? Because I looked thoroughly at how the word's used in the Pentateuch. And it's when it's used of a personal subject toward another personal subject, and especially in a judgment context, I think in all but 2 instances, let's just say 95% of the time, it had to do with the cessation of life. And I think there was only 2, or maybe I got my notes, but that didn't do that. But I did really quickly. There's a quick word study, so I don't want anybody to quote it. I would love somebody to go through really thoroughly and look at Pentateuch and prophetic literature and wisdom literature, and really do a thorough look at Septuagint. And as anybody, once they get into it, they're going to realize that the Septuagint doesn't exist.
Yeah.
There's various Greek scrolls and all these things that you need to get your arms around Septuagint studies,
right.
and so you can do a valid word search. And then I would love to see what are the Hebrew equivalents of that, and then look at Qumran, karat and kala and other Hebrew words in the Qumran scrolls that correlate with that. So I did that. I spent about a week doing that, and I'm not good with computer programs, so I don't think my words. I don't trust my own words sometimes. But if I had the time and energy, I think to be able to say, when we come to the New Testament, here is. Is there a very common way in which this word is used, and also paying attention to the context and judgment context with a personal agent acting on another? I think that'd be a valid thing. And I think, as you said before, I think offline, I think that doing deeper work in the early Jewish contribution to this topic would be super helpful. I think there's been some work done there, but not extensive.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Hopefully viewers will take that to heart, and if there are any of you budding scholars out there that want to join into the fray, here's some terrain that is ready to be mapped more accurately than has been in the past. Preston, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm so grateful for your friendship, and I'm glad that I was able to catch you in the hallway in passing at the National ETS meeting a few weeks ago, because I don't know if this would have happened otherwise. So thank you for the time you've given me today. I really appreciate it, and I'll look forward to talking to you again sometime.
My pleasure. Talk to you later, Chris.
Well, there you go. I hope that that you enjoyed the interview at least half as much as I enjoyed conducting it. It was a great conversation that I had with Preston, and I'm grateful and honored that I can call him a friend. As I mentioned before I began the interview, I wanted to follow up afterwards with just a brief look at something in one of the books that came up in the course of Preston's and my conversation, namely the book of First Enoch. There's been one regular viewer of Rethinking Hell Live who on almost every, if not every, episode of Rethinking Hell Live has posted in the comments about how the book of First Enoch somehow supports eternal torment, and ergo, from that it follows that the New Testament teaches eternal torment. I don't think that logic holds up, but even if it did, I think that that's a extreme simplification of the evidence from First Enoch, and that's what I want to look at. Really quickly, though, Ben said in the live chat that was an encouraging interview. I'm glad that it was for me as well, conducting it and watching it now a second time, and I hope that others not only are encouraged by it, but also inspired, exhorted, convicted by it. If there are those of you who are pastors, theologians, professors, and you're in ministry roles or professions where you have to be quiet about your belief in or lean toward conditional immortality or annihilationism, I know the prospect of going public with that can be very terrifying, but as John Stackhouse said at our very first annual conference back in 2014, and his talk is published in our second book, A Consuming Passion, Essays on Hell and Immortality in honor of Edward Fudge, as John Stackhouse said in that presentation, we need people in those positions to come forward. And because what's going to happen is that people are going to realize, that the masses are going to realize that there are simply too many Christians with clout, with prestige, with influence, with knowledge and training and respect and everything that hold this view that we can't keep silencing them and refusing to allow them to believe what they are convinced that the Bible teaches. And if they refuse to do that, then kick them out. We can't keep doing that. So I hope it's convicting in that way. Since Preston mentioned that one of the reasons he was able to do this study was because he had the freedom to at the institution that he worked for at the time. And then also, I hope that it's inspiring in the sense that I meant what I said to him. I've received a number of questions from people that are going into academia and who want to know how they can contribute to this debate. And I think that Preston gave some good examples of possible areas of research there. That's what I'm doing, and I'm not saying everybody should have to follow in my footsteps, not at all. But the more and more I've been thinking about what I want to do in my PhD, the more I realized that it's an opportunity to, inflame, to fuel my interest in making it through the work of a PhD by making it on a topic I'm interested in and which can contribute meaningfully to this debate. And so I hope that other people will consider doing likewise. Now, let me shift gears back to the intertestamental literature and look at the book of 1st Enoch. You'll see here in Logos Bible software that I've got the title page of The Fire That Consumes, which is the seminal work on this topic by Edward Fudge, who passed away a few years ago. And in that book, he has a section on intertestamental literature. And in that section on intertestamental literature, he has a few different sections. He's got a section on books that teach eternal torment. He's got another section, books that teach annihilation. And then he's got this section that he calls mixed testimony. And under this section of mixed testimony, he covers a few books where it appears as though you see exactly what I was trying to describe to Preston in that interview, namely language that sounds an awful lot like eternal torment right next to language that sounds a lot like annihilation and extinction. And so Edward Fudge, under the section... in the section on 1st Enoch, you can see that here, 1st Enoch. In the section under 1st Enoch, he has a section on eternal torment down here, unending conscious torment. But before that, he points out a number of passages that sound an awful lot like annihilation. They are driven from the face of the earth. They perish. Their life is at an end. I will destroy them from the face of the earth. No evildoers won't set foot on it. Worms will be their bed, meaning they'll be corpses and their corpses will get eaten up. The unrepentant will perish before him. Sinners will be destroyed before the face of the Lord. You keep going. God's enemies would be destroyed. This God's sword is drunk with blood. The righteous will never afterward see the face of the sinners and unrighteous. Sinners will die with the sinners, and the apostate go down with the apostate. And on it goes. Now, he goes on to acknowledge, as I've already pointed out, that there are passages that sound like eternal torment in there as well. But go back to that passage that I just quoted from the Community Rule. Let me pull that up one more time, just for those of you who might not have noticed it as we were discussing it in the interview. Excuse me. This is the transcriptions. I want the translation. Let's see if this is in the right place. May you be damned in return for all your wicked, guilty deeds. May the God of terror give you over to implacable avengers. May he visit your offspring with destruction at the hands of those who recompense evil with evil, and on it goes. There's language here that sounds like eternal torment and elsewhere in this scroll. But this word destruction here, as I pointed out in that interview with Preston, translates a Hebrew word that means to annihilate, to bring to a complete end. So the point I'm getting at is just to say that 1st Enoch, and I'm saying this to that one regular viewer of Rethinking Hell Live who keeps commenting in the comments about 1st Enoch, it is not at all clear to me that 1st Enoch does in fact teach eternal torment. If it's similar to the Community Rule, Dead Sea Scroll, in which language that sounds like eternal torment is right next to language that is definitively annihilation, then perhaps 1st Enoch is likewise a book that teaches annihilation, but using extremely hyperbolic, apocalyptic language. what might that mean for New Testament studies on those books that Enoch has influenced, like the book of Jude or like the book of Revelation even? So there's a lot of fruitful ground here, I think, ripe for the harvest, as I said to Preston. And so for those of you who are interested in studying this topic more and perhaps contributing to the ongoing dialogue, First Enoch and other intertestamental literature are great opportunities to do that research and to take things a step further. Historically, most or almost all of the research into this literature has been done by believers in eternal torment, because the church has been dominated by believers in eternal torment. That means that their conclusions are going to be somewhat biased by their perspectives, by their beliefs, by their previous conclusions and their presuppositions and so forth. But as more and more conditionalists, and for that matter, universalists, as more and more of us who don't believe in eternal torment dive into this intertestamental literature and begin to look at things with from a different perspective, we might find that some of the sweeping statements that a lot of traditionalists, believers in eternal torment, make about the intertestamental literature teaching eternal torment, we might find out that those sweeping statements aren't as true as they might have been previously thought to be. So hopefully that interview and my commentary on First Enoch and my follow-up to last episode at the beginning prior to the interview, hopefully all of that was helpful for you. Again, if you've enjoyed this video, please do click the like button. And if you would like to continue being notified about Rethinking Hell Live episodes as they're available and stuff like that, click subscribe. Again, doing both of those things will help our YouTube channel and videos to reach more YouTube viewers. Also, again, please do, if you feel convicted, offer a one-time or recurring donation to Rethinking Hell by going to rethinkinghell.com and clicking the PayPal button, or going to patreon.com/rethinkinghell. I could tell you that with this upcoming conference in November 6th and 7th of 2020, we're going to need to pay not only honorariums and travel fees for the other speakers, but we'll also need to pay, to rent the venue and to pay the audiovisual staff that will be doing the filming and streaming and things like that. So we definitely need your financial support. But even if you can't do that, your continued spiritual support, your emotional and encouraging support is also very valuable to us. Gary, excuse me. Sorry, my throat's a little itchy. Gary in the live chat says, Merry Christmas. Chris, thank you for saying that. And to all of you who've joined us on the 23rd of December, 2019, 2 days before Christmas, 1 day before Christmas Eve, Merry Christmas to you as well. And I hope that you'll join us next week, Monday, December 30th, 2 days before the New Year's, for our next episode of Rethinking Hell Live. And if you want to know what that episode is going to be about, then just keep an eye open on the Rethinking Hell Facebook group, where I'm announcing what the next episodes are going to be. Until then, I hope that you have a Merry Christmas and an enjoyable week. For those of you who get the week off of work, enjoy it, spend the time with your family, and maybe catch up on some school work and ministry work, as I intend to do. God bless, and until then.
Man, look, maybe we should rethink this whole thing. I mean, you heard the guy.
The pains of eternal torment.
Yeah, I gotta rethink this whole thing.